All right, we've heard President Obama's definition of leadership. He told us it's climate change. We heard Obama put climate change on a pedestal during his State of the Union address this past January. But I don't think he's really worried about how we treat the environment because of the Westlake landfill. Heard of it? We'll take a look.
Now, the landfill is an EPA Superfund site. It contains World War II-era nuclear waste. It's been a concern of residents for many years. Adjacent to Westlake is the Bridgeton trash landfill, where an underground fire has been burning. The EPA also today announced an agreement has been reached with the operators of the landfill on a schedule to determine what to do with the radioactive material.
This landfill, the Westlake landfill, is located in Bridgeton, Missouri. And it's a product of the Manhattan Project. Nuclear waste from when we created the first nuclear bomb in World War II was illegally dumped into the Westlake landfill in 1973. Once it was discovered what had happened, government handled it terribly, no surprise. Nobody could decide whether the situation should be an EPA Superfund, which is the federal government's program for cleaning up contaminated land, or whether it should be turned over to the Department of Energy and use the Army's cleanup program. Ultimately, it went to the EPA Superfund for cleanup in 1990, a quarter of a century ago. Residents of this area have been waiting 25 years for this cleanup. All the while, the president talks a big game about climate change and our environment. Inconsistent, right? Joining me today to discuss is president of the Market Institute, Charlie Sauer. Charlie, hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
All right, help me break this down for myself and for viewers. Basically, Bridgeton residents have been waiting for 25 years, Charlie, for the government to clean this up. What has the government actually done?
So, yeah, I mean, I think, laid it out perfectly, perfectly right. In 1990, the government finally designated Westlake landfill as a Superfund site. And the dumping happened in the 1970s from the 1940s Manhattan Project. So this has been going on for a long time, even before we got to 1990. But since 1990, they've been identifying the parties of interest. They've been doing studies. The Missouri environmental agencies have been doing studies. And all of those studies have come back that the landfill doesn't propose or will not be harmful to the community around it. And just this last year, the EPA finally came up with a proposal to solve the problem, and that involved doing some cleanup and creating an isolation barrier. And they had the private companies that were going to pay for it as they did the cleanup. And so, after 25 years, which is an amazingly long time, the Superfund project, the Superfunds always go through this long project. It's part of bureaucracy at its worst. This is government boondoggle at its worst. But after that 25 years, a couple of senators and a couple of representatives are actually proposing to hit the reset button and move it back 25 years. And so that process has to start over. It's amazing to watch, and I wouldn't believe it if I wasn't seeing it.
Right, it's like you said, it's bureaucracy at its worst. What a nightmare. Now, I want to go back to something you said, because it is a little hard for me to believe that all this nuclear waste, the CDC says there's no risk to this, no groundwater, air, soil contamination. Charlie, is that true? Yeah,
so I mean, the EPA studies have said this, and I can tell you what, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to tell you that what the EPA studies are true or false. What I can say is that all of the studies to this point by the government have said that it's safe. And now what Senator McCaskill and Representative Ann Wagner over in the House are proposing is they're saying that, we just need to hand it over to the Army Corps of Engineers. And one of their claims is that these studies are wrong. But before you hit the reset button 25 years, before you go back through this process, and the process that they want to go through spends $400 million of the taxpayers' money, before they do that, I think we should at least have a debate over whether the science is right or for whether the studies were good. And I mean, I think that it goes to your question. I can't answer it. I'm an economist, so I look at the numbers that these senators want to spend. They want to spend $400 million. It's just like the senators spending an earmark. When I was on Capitol Hill, we used to earmark to the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's exactly what this looks like. And, I think that that's what we're looking at is an earmark. But they could be upset about the science. Either way, it should be a debate on Capitol Hill. and we should actually go through regular order before we hit a 25-year reset button.
Right, and maybe have some objective people, some people from the private industry do studies so that there's no conflict of interest. Now, there's another waste disposal, if you will, another landfill, a nearby site that's also causing concern. It may be what's brought this debate to a head again because there's subsurface smoldering. What's the residents' concern there, Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concern in this whole area. And if I was in the Westlake area, if I lived there, I would be concerned too. And that's one of the worst parts about the whole Superfund process is, I mean, after the 1990 designation, and I mean, this started in the mid-'80s, so, but it was finally designated in 1990 a Superfund site. And it took the 25 years just to get to this proposal. And it involves, you know, this isolation barrier to make sure that no subsurface contamination happens. And so we just don't want to hit that 25-year reset button. So the community has to continue to be under the threat of exactly what you pointed out. I mean, we don't know what the subsurface fire is doing. We don't know where the contamination's exactly from. If the senators want to look into it, I think that could make sense, but we want to have a hearing and slow the process down. Senator McCaskill pushed her bill through the Senate by unanimous consent, and Representative Ann Wagner from Missouri is trying to push her bill through a system called the suspension calendar, which means that nobody ever discusses or debates the bill. And so, I mean, I think that what we should look at is helping out the community of Westlake and getting the solution done as fast as possible. When you have private companies that are looking to solve the problem in 2016, I think that's at least a good start before we talk about setting us back 25 years.
Right, and Charlie, it seems to me that whenever there's a situation where politicians aren't willing to debate the pros and cons, there's some political motivation involved that doesn't have to do with the good of the people that they're debating, whether it's this bill or something else. So I would agree with your call to be more open in this process, have a debate about what's best, because 25 years, that's absurd. The residents of that area deserve something better. Charlie.